Sometimes I wish I understood my own mind a bit better. But how can you really know your own thoughts? It's like trying to understand your haircut without a mirror. There is no mirror for the psyche, except maybe the life it builds around itself. If that's the case, then my psyche is a rundown mess and could use a fresh coat of paint. My name is Anonymous Cubed. I'm a detective and I live in my detective's office. I'm not supposed to, but nobody knows. So don't tell anybody, I might get in trouble. I sleep in my suit. I live in my suit. I have 2 suits and 7 pairs of socks and 3 pairs of underwear. I wash one of my suits once a week while I wear the other one, and then the next week I swap them out. It costs me $3 a week at the laundry. That's over $150 a year. Who knows what I could do with that money if I didn't have to pay to clean my clothes? Maybe I could sponsor an orphan child in another country. Maybe I could afford to eat something for breakfast that wasn't cold mushroom soup spooned out of the can. Big dreams. So some kid hires me to find his pet turtle that I guess ran away. I don't think turtles can run exactly, but at any rate it managed to disappear, and now he's freaking out and offering me $23 he'd saved up, and I don't want to take the kid's cash, but honestly I'm quite broke and could really use $20 to see me through to next week. The kid's name was The Kid. He was a big guy in his mid-40s. He said everybody had just called him The Kid since he was a little boy and he didn't know how to make them stop, and eventually his own mother had to admit that she'd forgotten his original name and he had to just roll with it. "Why don't you make up a new name?" I asked him. "This isn't about that," he'd said to me, crushing a freshly emptied soup can with one of his massive meaty fists. "This is about the president." That was the name of his turtle, Mr. the President if you're feeling formal. Have you ever searched the city for a turtle? I certainly haven't. But luckily I have a few connections. That's a big part of my job, making connections and then exploiting them. It's like building houses out of those little interlocking plastic blocks, except instead of houses, I'm crafting a construction of interpersonal relationships throughout the city. I am the spider at the center of the web. Or maybe I'm the fly, and the spider is a metaphor for new knowledge, or something thematic like that. First, I went to see my friend Alice, who lives under the Burrard Street Bridge. Alice is a magician, and offered to sell me a magic rock that could find turtles. But I had to explain to her that I was flat broke and I needed a more manageable form of turtle location. She said I'd have better luck jerking off into an empty hat, which was her folksy way of saying that she was unable to help me any further. So next, I visited my old chum Charles, who earns change by flicking lit cigarettes out of the air with his ears. He's also an accomplished playwright, award-winning, but nobody's paying him any money for that. So I says to him, "Charles, have you seen any turtles in your travels?" Because I know that Charles is a guy who covers a lot of territory in a day. But Charles doesn't want to talk about turtles. Charles is concerned that super intelligent insects are taking over the government and nobody cares. Charles says he saw a movie about it when he was little, but nobody else remembers the movie, so maybe it only exists in his head. I suggested maybe he was supposed to write the movie himself, and that's when he started coughing real hard and tried to stab me with his pen. Finally, I checked in with old Mrs. McMurray, a tall, broad-shouldered Hungarian woman with some of the best tracking soft and hardware in town. Give her a target and she had free-floating spy drones all over the city just waiting for the work. She built them herself out of scraps of an old Soviet spy satellite she brought over with her from the old country back in the early 1960s. I love old Mrs. McMurray, but she doesn't care much for me, as I generally am always owing her between $16,000 and $60,000. These days I think I only owe her $2,000 and a kidney, and that's not really too much in the grand scheme of things. She didn't want to help me for nothing, so I had to ask real nice, and basically she sent me on a little secondary mission, claiming that she'd get me the information I was looking for, so long as I could get her a bag of the new type of corn chip that just came out. It was waffle and whiskey flavored, and folks were fighting each other to a bloody pulp all over town, just to get their bloody paws on a bag. So out I went. The first 3 shops I went by just laughed at me when I inquired as to their access to the snack foods I was seeking, but the 4th, he let out a wounded whimper that implied to me that there was more to his story than he was letting on. Cutting to the meat of it, I eventually discovered that he was being held hostage by a pack of 9-year-olds armed with homemade blowtorches and a sack of doorknobs. They'd been in the midst of torturing him just for the fun of it when I'd walked in, and would have done the same to me had I not been quick enough on my feet and fast enough with my fists to defeat this small street gang of armed and dangerous little children. It wasn't my finest moment, but at least I came out on top. I can still hear the sounds of their little bones breaking as I broke their little bones, but honestly, I only did what I had to in order to survive. As it was, I figured it would take at least a couple of weeks for all the hair on my arms to grow back. The clerk my self-preservation had inadvertently rescued thought I was a real cool guy, and he offered to repay me in the currency of his people, mixtapes and back rubs. I told him I was looking for some of those waffle and whiskey-flavored chips, and he said, "Sure, who isn't?" But I could tell that there was more to his story than that. I could see the facts hiding somewhere just behind his eyes. A few slaps to the face and he was talking, squawking even, like he was eager to give it up. He had one bag left and he'd been keeping it for himself. I demanded them in payment for coming to his defense, and he went for my throat. Luckily, my throat was still slick with the blood of the children I'd just beaten up, so his hands had trouble gaining purchase, and while he struggled to maintain his grasp, I picked up the now unconscious body of one of the children I'd taken down, and I used the child's head to beat the clerk back into his booth. Luckily, these were tough children of the street, and I knew they could handle a little kicking around. With the guard and his attackers all peacefully slumbering, there was no one to stop me from just taking the chips and leaving, so that's what I did. I took him back to old Mrs. McMurray, who thanked me until it got uncomfortable, and then she handed over the information I'd been looking for. It was just as I'd begun to theorize. I thanked her for the assistance and headed back home, to my office. I walked back into my office and discovered the kid already there going through my stuff. "Oh crap," he said as I entered. "This was unexpected. What will the kid do now?" "Quit narrating," I warned him. "I'm on to your plan." "You got it all figured out, do ya?" asked the kid. "You never had a turtle," I told him, fixing him with my most steely of gazes. "You just wanted me out of my office, so you could steal my soup." "You're right," he admitted, "and I would have gotten away with it too if you hadn't gotten bored and come home early." Then the kid let out a laugh that ran around the place like a mischievous ghost, rattling the windows and shaking the lamps. "Well, that's my soup," I told him, "and if you want it, it's $1 a can." The kid paid me $1.25 and then cracked open the can. As he hungrily licked out the gummy soup from the inside of the cracked container, his tongue began to bleed from a dozen tiny cuts received from the jagged edges of the aluminum can. I pocketed the quarters and told him to get out of my office and never come back again. He thanked me, which was somewhat difficult due to his tongue being so severely lacerated, and then he departed. My name's Anonymous Cubed. I'm a detective. I solve cases. But sometimes those cases aren't real cases. They're just frustrating ruses meant to distract me from getting any real work done. Anyway, that's another one of my stories. Is it a story? I don't know. It's just something that happened to me anyway. And now you've listened to it.